Welcome to the Voices of Israeli Rabbis podcast. I'm your host, Rabbi Phil Cohen. In June 2025, I traveled to Israel, expecting to meet in person with some 10 Israeli rabbis. That journey, however, coincided with Israel's conflict with Iran, which meant I spent a good deal of time in my Airbnb shelter, and that travel around the country was ill-advised. As a result, I conducted all but one of these conversations from the relative comfort of my Airbnb. I came to realize that their lives and work were fascinating. More than that, they constituted a remarkable community whose contributions are little understood outside of Israel. I decided to devote this podcast exclusively then to Israeli rabbis and to share their stories with a world that often knows Israel only through the headlines. So I speak with rabbis from every stream of Jewish life and every corner of Israeli society. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the Voices of Israeli Rabbis podcast, as my guest and I build a permanent oral history of Israeli religious life, one conversation at a time. My next guest is Professor Adam Ferzinger of Bar-Ilan University, one of Israel's leading historians of modern Judaism. His research explores the religious and intellectual forces that have shaped Jewish life in the modern era. Our conversation centers on his award-winning book, Agents of Change: American Jews and the Transformation of Israeli Judaism. In it, Professor Ferzinger tells the story of a relatively small group of creative, intellectually open, and deeply committed and well-educated Orthodox Jewish immigrants from North America, whose influence reached far beyond their numbers. Through their ideas, institutions, and their leadership, they have helped reshape religious Zionism in Israel and have left a lasting imprint on Israeli religious life. In our conversation, we explore how this small group of remarkable individuals, men and women, helped transform the character of Israeli Judaism and why their influence continues to be felt today. I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with Professor Adam Ferzinger. On the other side of the screen is Dr. Adam Ferzinger, who has written what I think is an absolutely marvelous book because it's very dense, it's very thick in its research. Its topic is eye-opening to anybody who's interested in religious life in Israel. The book is called Agents of Change, and the subtitle is American Jews and the Transformation of Israeli Judaism, which already tells you a great deal about the book. The book is about the immigration of a significant number of modern Orthodox Jews over about a 20-year period and what they brought to Israel, the tremendous influence they had individually in the institutions they built and the teaching that they did, and how it impacted Israeli society, and that a significant amount of that impact came back to the United States. The word that Adam uses throughout the book is transnationalism. I want to start with a number of characters that you talk about at the beginning of the book. I'm going to mention some names, and we can talk about them as needed as the conversation goes. We don't necessarily have to talk about all of them, but let's talk about who they were and what they brought to Israel, and we'll see where the conversation goes from there. And I'm talking about Aharon Lichtenstein, David Hartman, Bravender, I don't remember his first name, Steve or Shlomo Riskin, right? And in the end, you bring in Jonathan Sachs, although he didn't really immigrate, but his influence became very significant post-mortem, actually. So let's start with Hartman. In some ways, he's easiest because I think to American Jews who are not familiar with the Israeli scene, he's the most identifiable. So let's start with David Hartman.
Okay. So first of all, Phil, thank you so much for this invitation. And, I grew up in America and moved to Israel 39 years ago. I'm a professor at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, but very much connected. And that's probably why this book, and maybe I'm an insider, outsider in both places, but this book kind of brings together some of my background and influences on me and the world I live in, and trying to look at it through the lens of the tools that I've been given. The broader thesis of the book is about how a cadre of people came to Israel in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, and were kind of foreigners. They were Martians. People didn't understand who these people were. They came from Yeshiva University. They were Orthodox Jews, but they were very much involved in modern society, educated, etc. And what I argue in the book is that it took about 30 years until their impact really was felt. And that's what we're feeling in the 21st century. And that's because they were foreigners, but they had great ideas. And what happened was they all established institutions educational institutions where Israelis studied. And those Israelis internalized their ideas and then they ran with them. And what we're seeing today is not the group that I'm referring to has upstaged other dominant groups within Israeli society and Israeli religious culture, but they have become part of that conversation in a significant way. So David Hartman is such an interesting man, and I have so much to say about him. I'll try not to overstate. David Hartman grew up actually children of immigrants from Brooklyn, studied in more what you would call traditionalists, or some would say Haredi yeshivot, and he made his way to Yeshiva University to a big degree because he was a great ball player. And I'm a big Knicks fan. This is a big day for me because
it was basketball. He was a basketball.
Yeah. He was a really good point guard, and they recruited him for the team. And he played on one of the best teams that Yeshiva University ever had. They called him Duvi Hartman in those days. And anyway, it's a big day for me, so I just had to get that basketball in right away. The parade's going to go on real soon. But he was really into studying Talmud, so much so that after a year in Yeshiva University of studying secular studies in the afternoon and Talmud in the morning, he said, I can't do this. I've got to study Gemara all day. And he ran away to Lakewood, New Jersey to study with Aaron Cutler, the great Eastern European scholar who detested secular society and secular knowledge. Spent a year there, same time as Shlomo Carlebach, the great Rabbi rock singer. So it was an interesting time in the 1940s. Then he came back to YU and he studied with Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, who was this synthetic, fascinating Talmud scholar, philosopher, German trained, but with his roots in Lithuania. And Hartman eventually gets a PhD from Fordham University, Catholic University in New York, and makes his way to Montreal, has a distinguished rabbinical career. And then at the age of, in 1971, he makes Aliyah. He immigrates to Israel.
I'm going to interrupt you. First of all, just a little side comment. I noted, not with any criticism, that one of the things you continually emphasize among the characters you study are their PhDs. And for you, and maybe in reality as well, that PhD gives them a kind of a dual identity. But you said he got a PhD at Fordham, Hartman did. In what?
In theology and philosophy. And that's what he did. He was really a theologian. He wasn't just an analytic philosopher. He's a person who produced really interesting theology that is read by people and that's influential. But he's also an institution builder, and that's a great combination. Somebody who has ideas, but also recognizes the need, if those ideas are going to have traction moving forward, to have students. He created the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Today, that is a really far-reaching space in Jerusalem with high schools, rabbinical training programs, scholars programs, interfaith programs with Muslims, activities with rabbis coming from abroad, activities involving students coming from abroad for men, women in the same Beit Midrash, the same study hall. Moreover, especially in the last decade and a half, under the leadership of Yehuda Kurtzer, the Shalom Hartman Institute has become a force within American Judaism. And so, Phil, you were talking about the transnational and sort of boomerang effect of all this. That's a great example of an institution started by immigrants that was sort of developed further by their Israeli constituency. And that Israeli constituency then hooked up with like-minded or parallel forces in America. And today there is so much Jewish learning that is going on throughout the world due maybe to the fact that Hartman got up and moved to Israel in 1971. Who knows?
We got a lot of fish to fry, but I want to pause and talk about Soloveitchik, Rabbi Dr. Soloveitchik, because anybody who's aware of sort of the American Jewish scene or the American and Israeli Jewish scene will see all of these interesting people, many famous ones, but then less famous, who studied with Soloveitchik and whose identity is wrapped up in this Torah Umadda identity. I don't know that Soloveitchik came up with that, Torah and science, which is the slogan of Yeshiva University. It's on the wall next to the elevator. So Hartman, Yitz Greenberg, Riskin, I mean, maybe all the people we talked about. Lichtenstein was a son-in-law, correct?
Lichtenstein was a son-in-law. He's married to his daughter, Dr. Tova Lichtenstein.
His influence as a prolegomenon to these people you're talking about was just enormous. And if you spend a moment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Remarkable human being. And I don't like hagiography, and I'm an historian. I have no problem showing my appreciation, and I'm totally, even, I'm in my book. I don't try to claim objectivity. It's my interpretation. It's existential in certain ways. But he was a remarkable person who comes from a very strong Eastern European pedigree, but pedigree that was both traditionalist and not broad in terms of engaging the modern world, but also anti-Zionist. And some of his cousins till today run the Brisker Yeshiva in Jerusalem that is very much not Torah and science, we'll put it that way. But he was this person who, at a certain point, his father, Moshe Soloveitchik, moved to Warsaw. And by then, he was a teenager, Joseph B. Soloveitchik. And he eventually did the tests in order to be accepted into university studies in Warsaw, and then made his way to Berlin and wrote a PhD about the post-Kantian philosophy of Hermann Cohen.
It was on Hermann Cohen's logic. It's sort of an amazing PhD.
It's a remarkable work. And
you're right.
And eventually he settled in Boston, but after his father, who had been appointed to be the central figure in Yeshiva University's rabbinic studies, passed away in the 40s, he eventually was chosen. And for the next 40 plus years, he was the central figure in Yeshiva University. He mostly taught Talmud, but he also taught philosophy in their graduate school. And he published some seminal works. But you can actually go on YouTube. It's really interesting, whether some of the stuff is in Yiddish, but some of it's in English. He was really a charismatic teacher. I know he was a very demanding teacher, but he had a strong imprint on the lives of the people who studied with him. But I want to do something, if you'll allow me, Phil, which is a great story, because what I didn't say about David Hartman, is that very influential, but certainly my 8 agents of change are not all the same. They may have come from similar backgrounds, but they all took it in different ways, and they weren't on the same page. Lichtenstein, Soloveitchik's son-in-law, was certainly more conservative with a small c than David Hartman, who was considered a radical, and maybe even towards the end of his life, sort of his theology moved beyond orthodox classical terms. But it's an interesting thing, because of that, there was always a kind of competition. Who is the real student of Soloveitchik? Like any great teacher, there are always going to be multiple interpretations. But many people who were not of the Hartman ilk sort of tried to make the argument that Hartman has sort of written himself out of the Soloveitchik spectrum. And, that's a debate. But my friend, Professor Larry Kaplan from McGill University, told me a great story. It's in the book, I think, in a footnote. He translated Soloveitchik's Halachic Man into English in the 1980s. And he told me, Kaplan, that he went up to Boston to show Soloveitchik the galleys. And he's waiting outside Soloveitchik's office in his home, his daughter's home in Boston, the Twerskys. And who comes out of Soloveitchik's office? David Hartman. By now, he's been in Israel for 10 years. By now, he's sort of starting to develop his own approach. And Kaplan's a young guy. He walks into the office, and Soloveitchik says to him in his thick European accent, he says, do you know who that is? And Kaplan says, sure, that's David Hartman, David Hartman. He says, what do you think of him? Now, from Soloveitchik's got David Hartman. Larry Kaplan said to me, Adam, I said to him, what do I think of him? What do you think of him? So Larry said, he's really smart, very dynamic, kind of controversial. So Rabbi Soloveitchik looked at Kaplan and he says to him, he's a searcher, needs discipline. I like him.
That's nice. That's a good story. That's a great story. So let's turn to Aharon Lichtenstein. A little bit about his background, but also what he did. He strikes me, and maybe you can affirm or deny this, that he has an outsized, not exaggerated, but an outsized role in your book.
Absolutely, for 2 reasons. Because I think that I make a strong claim that he is a game changer, but also I studied with him. So I knew him personally, and I've written other pieces about him beforehand. So here's a man who was actually born in France. His parents had gone there during the war. He even actually spent a year in a convalescent home because he was sick without Jews around when he was about 6 or 7 years old. But eventually his father was somewhat of an Orthodox maskil, kind of an intellectual, had a PhD himself from Germany. His mother was from a very well-known rabbinic sort of space in the Telzer Yeshiva in Eastern Europe. They moved to America, traveled around, eventually settled in Brooklyn. He was considered like an Ilui, what we call a genius at a young age, studied in actually the same yeshiva as David Hartman. They were also later study partners in Yeshiva University. He comes to Yeshiva University to study with Soloveitchik. He could have gone to Lakewood. He debated and decided to go to Yeshiva University because of Soloveitchik's creativity and his Talmudic learning. Studies with Soloveitchik, becomes very close to him, is already in his early 20s considered sort of the heir apparent to Soloveitchik. And then he says, I'm leaving, I'm moving to Boston because I've been accepted to a PhD program in English literature in Harvard. Clean-shaven guy, never grew a beard, spent 4 years in Boston studying Christian humanists, Milton, Moore. Later on, he was very interested in C.S. Lewis. Real religious Christians, great writers, Shakespeare. He also studied with Soloveitchik when he came home for the weekends. He also apparently met his daughter.
Apparently.
But or they only got married a couple years later, but they must have started to know each other. And so after he finishes his PhD, he's invited back to YU. His first job was teaching English in Stern College for Women, the YU Women's College. Eventually he becomes head of their Kollel, their advanced Talmud study program. And again, 1960s, YU in the 1960s is a really interesting place. We have people like Lichtenstein, Hartman's in Montreal, but he's very involved. Great scholars like Charles Liebman. Yitz Greenberg is teaching history there. It's a really interesting time. And Soloveitchik is in his prime, and they're involved in the Soviet Jewry movement. They're involved in anti-Vietnam demonstrations, civil rights, all sorts of interesting things. 1971, Soloveitchik's wife had already died. Again, Lichtenstein is the man. He and his wife and their 5 children are offered a job at a small fledgling yeshiva called Yeshivat Har Etzion, started right after the 67 war in a place called Gush Etzion, south of Jerusalem. And he accepts that invitation. And basically, he, together with the founding rabbi, Rav Yehuda Amital, create this yeshiva, which today is one of the largest in Israel, a Hesder yeshiva, where the students combine Talmud study with army service for 5 years. And then they have many, many other programs that have been built. And so here we have this guy, clean shaving, who wears tweed jackets, looks like a Harvard professor. He shows up, Gush Etzion, and he's teaching Talmud in a very original way, his take on Soloveitchik. So no one can diss him, because he's got it. But then he's giving these speeches about the weekly Sedra, the weekly portion, or about different events. And he's citing C.S. Lewis, and he's citing Cardinal Newman, and he's citing all sorts of interesting Christian theologians or literary figures, and you really do not know what to do with them. But over time, this yeshiva grows, and hundreds upon hundreds of students, they start a women's yeshiva called Migdal Oz that his daughter is the head of till today, and all sorts of things that develop from it. And many of the students eventually start their own yeshivot. And there you see this figure who's can't be disrespected as an authority from a Talmudic religious perspective, but is talking a language which is so different than what is common in the Israeli religious discourse, be it the religious Zionists, be it the Haredim, be it anybody. And so there is where you have a very transitional figure. And among the things that is so original about him, and this was actually the first thing I ever wrote about him, is his whole perception of the relationship between Orthodox Jews and Jews who choose other paths, whether that be Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Secular Zionist, also regarding issues of the role of women, also regarding issues of LGBTQs. He develops what I call an approach of fragmentary Judaism, where he recognizes not only what might be missing in other people, but what might be missing in his own religious milieu, and how the two, by recognizing the lack, you also can appreciate what you can learn from the others. A lot of Orthodox, even tolerant Orthodox figures sort of say, well, what can you do? Modern world, people are not all observant. But it's sort of like a Nebuch, what can you do? And so, and Lichtenstein is like, I have so much to learn from people who are different from me. It doesn't mean I agree with them. He's not a pluralist. I disagree with them vehemently, but I still have a great deal to learn from them. And that is the seed of his respect. And maybe that seems obvious to us, but in many Orthodox circles, that wasn't. And again, his students internalized that type of mutual respect and developed a framing for that. And then they established their own institutions. So I think that's what makes Lichtenstein, among others, such a prolific and important figure in this story.
It's a great story. And to my mind, that kind of attitude, this fragmentary attitude, is really important and really unique. It's not unique because you have other people who do similar kinds of things, but it's important in Israeli society. So the question I'm about to ask about what Lichtenstein accomplished, maybe you may have already answered in a sense, but how does that attitude manifest itself on the Israeli street?
That's where I kind of started. Because we moved to Israel again 39 years ago. We moved to Israel in the 1980s. The 1980s, none of this stuff was on the Israeli street. Very rarely, maybe you'd go into sort of Anglo, very small circles, or there were very particular congregations. And all of a sudden, in the 2000s, I started seeing a lot more of this stuff. And it seemed to be becoming more normativized and more, again, part of the conversation. And then I asked myself, why and how did this come? And I'm a historian. So I started to look retrospectively and how these ideas came there. First of all, I'm very glad you asked the question, because one of the things that I was hoping with this book is that it wouldn't be a sectorial book, because what it does is open up people's eyes. And I don't mean from a sort of a public relations perspective, but from a really rigorous perspective into a side of Israeli society that people are not that aware of, and that often the headlines, the nature of the thing, I have a brother who's a journalist, it's always about man bites dog, not dog bites man. Excuse me. So we hear about the more extreme voices, and they're there, and I'm not in a denial, but we rarely hear about a kind of moderacy that actually, even if it is distinctive from the American religious culture and Jewish identity in many ways, has overlaps and therefore has potential for more interfacing in a mutually respectful way. The issue of women is huge. Women, of course, Orthodoxy is allegiant to its interpretation of halakha, which is based on the Shulchan Aruch of Joseph Caro and its following interpreters. So there's less sort of flexibility, certainly than the reform approach, which is completely different, but also the conservative evolutionary approach. By the way, I wrote a book a couple of years ago for the Melton schools on Jewish denominations, which is, thank God, I'm very proud of this book. It's actually been taught in, scores, if not hundreds, of Melton centers around the world. It's called Jewish Denominations, Addressing the Challenges of Modernity. And I'm very grateful that I've chosen my path, and I've been able to learn a lot about people like my dear friend David Ellenson of blessed memory, and many others who were very, very committed and thoughtful and important, productive people within our Jewish culture and world. And it's really a privilege to engage with them.
If you had a concluding sentence or two, what did I cut you off from saying?
I just wanted to say that the role of women in religious society, again, it's not egalitarian in the way that in reform, but leadership and intellectual involvement, something that in Israel is very huge and very different than America. The Israeli army, which all 18-year-olds are drafted, but the women generally have a dispensation. But today, many, many, many Israeli religious women choose to join the army rather than being looked down upon. I have two daughters who are observant, I guess you call them religious Zionist Orthodox daughters, who both served in the Israeli army, not in combat positions, but they contributed in their way. And they're both observant women, and they didn't see any conflict. That's something that didn't exist in the 1980s.
So to point out to people who are watching this, if you are a religious woman, you can opt out of the army by going into national service. And what you point out in the book, I don't have the number in front of me, but while the number of women electing to go into the army as opposed to national service is still a minority of such women, the number over a period of time was increased dramatically. That's the point you're making. I want to come back to that because something you said before sparked in me the question about the area I'm about to move into. And if we have time, I want to go back to some of these other individuals. But one of the things that you point out, if I got the thesis correctly, is that the struggle, maybe too strong a word, the struggle with biblical criticism with JEP&D has a different outcome in Israel than in America. That, by the way, in your book, you keep saying IMO, and in my head, it was always Israeli modern Orthodoxy, but you say it's Israeli moderate Orthodoxy.
Distinguish it from American modern Orthodoxy. I don't think they're the same thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, you don't mention this, but something that brought a struggle, a way of resolving biblical criticism is this book by David Weiss Halevny, which you don't mention, called Revelation Restored. But never mind. He has his own way of trying to get to biblical. He's an Orthodox guy, as I'm sure you know. He has a way of coming to biblical.
Bill, I have to interrupt you because I have to tell you a David Weiss Halevny story. I knew him quite well. Very famous for a certain quote. I was at a Shabbat table with him and I said, Professor Halevny, I love that quote of yours where you say, I can't pray with the people I speak to, and I can't speak with the people I pray. And that idea of his conflict of living in these two worlds. But it was interesting. You know, he's a Holocaust survivor. He was a great Talmud scholar, and he was also a professor at Columbia before that at JTS. And he said something interesting, which is challenging. He said, Adam, but no one quotes the end of what I said. What I said was, I can't pray with the people I speak with. I can't speak with the people I pray with. But when forced to choose between the two groups, I will choose the people I pray with because I can live without speaking, but I can't live without praying.
That's very nice. That's very nice. So there's a significant part in the book you talk about the moderate Israeli Orthodox confrontation with biblical criticism. And I found it quite interesting. I think I said this already because they come to more accepting terms of it than was the case in America, maybe because of the denominational issues in the United States. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. You know, my friend, Professor Mark Shapiro was the first one to notice that in the last couple of decades, there have been Orthodox figures who were more open to higher criticism and exploring historicism regarding biblical passages and all sorts of things that in the past were sort of considered, out of the realm of orthodoxy. And there were controversies in the 60s, Louis Jacobs in UK, Yitzhak Greenberg to a certain degree in the United States. And all of a sudden, people who were sort of 2 feet within the Orthodox community were citing biblical scholarship, archaeology, dating, willing to look at things that as less historical and more as metaphorical, etc. And then I took the next stage and sort of asked, so who are these people? And what I discovered was almost every one of them lived in Israel. And almost every one of them was part of the religious Zionist world and part of that more moderate group that I wrote my book about. And I asked myself, like you said, why? So certainly the lack of denominational divide or the conservative and Masorti and reform movements in Israel are very important, and they service constituencies in very important ways. I served in the army with Meir Azari, the rabbi of Beit Daniel in Tel Aviv, in the Bavli section. I have other friends who, Levi Kelman, people I respect very much, but it's boutique. You know, Shlomo Avineri, the famous political scientist, famously said, he must be very famous because I said that a few times, he said, synagogue I do not enter is the Orthodox synagogue. So that's the one I don't pray in. Meaning he didn't really see Reform and Conservative as relevant to his non-observance. So the denominational struggle that characterized American life in the 20th century is not part of the Israeli religious scene. But I think there's more than that. I think that there's a certain openness towards academia and appreciation for academia. You mentioned PhDs before. It's not like people are worshiping PhDs, but there's a recognition that there is a strong contribution to a religious existence and contemporary life through exposure to science and scientific thinking. But I think there's also a piece that's really important. You know, Israeli religious life, ironically, everyone talks about the rabbinate and about how they control everything. They control some very important issues, really important issues: conversion, marriage, divorce, burial, and stuff. But when it comes to the day-to-day, in certain ways, Israel is really like the Wild East. Like in America, if you're in a Reform congregation, there are rules. There are rules to being a rabbi, a Reform rabbi. There are rules to being a part of the Reform movement. Conservative rabbis to this day cannot perform intermarriages, even though in many communities, over half the people in the congregation are intermarried. They have to refer them to their Reform colleagues. You don't have any of that in Israel. It's really, it's freestyle. And Israelis are pioneers. They're chalutzim. They like to go on edge. They're kind of always looking, towards what's the new thing, and they're bold. So I think that you have these sort of combinations of very observant and very committed Orthodox rabbis and women Torah scholars who are exposed and are drawing from academic studies of the Bible that don't fit into the American sort of culture of orthodoxy. That facilitates interesting conversations in places like the Torah.com and other types of 929 that are sort of post-denominational. And Hadar is an interesting American transplant, which is now starting the Hadar Institute from Manhattan, which is starting to gain a lot of traction in Israel, I think for the same reasons. I think that your mention of the chapter on biblical criticism is quite important.
Yeah, so a quick word about Torah.com, because you focus on that nicely, and it's important.
So Torah.com is this website which was started by Mark Brettler, who was a professor at Duke, very distinguished Bible scholar, an observant Jew. I don't know how he self-defines, but he's certainly an observant Jew, but very much adopts a higher criticism in his own personal work. Another scholar by the name of Zev Farber, who is an Orthodox rabbi, and a third person whose name escapes me right now. And it's sort of this place where people talk about Bible using scientific tools with a tremendous amount of respect for tradition. They're not looking to upend tradition, but they're certainly not beholden to a sort of doctrinal rules of traditionalist orthodoxy. Some people love it. Some people who are more conservative, with a small c again, find it disturbing and problematic. What's wonderful about the world we live in is that, the social media and all the tools we have at our disposal sort of allow people to traverse as they choose. And it's much harder to censor, to limit people. And therefore, a Reform rabbi from Florida is having a conversation with an Israeli religious Zionist scholar who has rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva University and wrote a book about Israeli society online right now.
So that's a great example of your transnational thesis. And of course, as you say, social media helps to facilitate that because there are no boundaries. I want to pivot to Daf Yomi, the Daf Yomi phenomenon. And you can tie this into your discussion of Israeli moderate Orthodox feminism and what happens when Daf Yomi gets owned by women as well as men.
Well, here we have to start with my wife. So my wife is not a Jewish studies scholar. She's a occupational therapist and a PhD in neuroscience. She's an academic, and she's the head of an international school at Ono Academic College. But she loves Torah. And someone we know well, Michelle Farber, has been teaching every day. This is now the second round, a folio of Talmud. This was the Daf Yomi, the daily folio, is something that was started in 1923 in Vienna, as a way to sort of unite the Jewish world, but really unite the Orthodox world, that everyone's going to study the same page. By that time, there's tons of immigration. Actually, America was about to close its borders then. But he said, a guy gets on a boat in Hamburg and makes their way to Buenos Aires, and they find themselves in a synagogue, and they look at the people there and they say, what daf are we on? What page are we on? And then they sit there and they study together, and then there's this connection. And but this Daf Yomi phenomenon really picked up after the Holocaust, and particularly from the 1970s within the Haredi world, but also within the modern Orthodox and religious Zionist world. And the internet has really been an engine because you don't have to go to a class anymore. You can sit in your room like I do when I study Daf Yomi and listen to a class in Hebrew and English and Yiddish and Russian and French and join a group. There are all sorts of things that are going on in that way. So that's interesting in and of itself. And other people have written a little bit about that. But my wife decided, she was inspired by the last end of the cycle 6 years ago, to join Michelle Farber's Daf Yomi group, which was originally live. We lived in a place called Kfar Saba, and Michelle taught in her home in Ra'anana nearby. And if you missed the class, you could watch, there wasn't a Zoom, you could watch a recording on YouTube or something like that the next day. Then all of a sudden, 2020, a terrible thing happened called COVID, and people weren't leaving their houses. But Michelle said, we're not going to stop learning that daily folio. And she went online like all of us did with Zoom. And since then, her class has exploded because rather than her small cadre of women from her neighborhood, she has hundreds of women from all over the world studying. And when my wife gets on to study at 7:15 in the morning, there are women in LA who are studying at 9:15 at night, women in New York studying at 12:15 at night, and women in Melbourne or Sydney studying at, I don't know the hour, but sometime in the late afternoon. And this becomes this fascinating, globalized virtual community. So Michelle Farber's American. She came to Israel. She studied in Israeli advanced women's yeshivot, something which is a relatively novel phenomenon. She's an excellent teacher. And one of the things I found out is lots of people who are not Orthodox also join because there's no membership rules. You just want to have to study and you just want to have to get online. And it's really become this remarkable phenomenon. And I even argued in that article, this is a little bit more academic nuance, that in a way it sort of neutralizes all sorts of rules like the mechitza, like the separation, because all of a sudden there's no rabbinic control, there's no authority. It's just, the screen. So this is Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah in a fascinating way. This is from Zion shall Torah go forth in a fascinating way. And you see here how the growth of schools like the one started by Lichtenstein's daughter and the one started by Chana Henkin, Nishmat, or Matan, started by Malka Bina. These are all women who came from America and taught Israelis and Americans. And now it's going from Israel and it's facilitating a more egalitarian plane for Torah study throughout the world. And I find that inspiring.
Well, so for the short time back in the 70s, when I was in Yeshivat Or Sameach, there was a famous, I guess he was famous, Orthodox commentator, teacher named Avigdor Miller. And you don't recognize the name, that's fine. I don't know why.
I recognize it. I'm sure I might learn much from him. Not exactly my natural cup of tea.
So that's exactly right. So I'm listening to a tape by the guy, and it's in a class, and somebody asks him, well, what about women studying Talmud? And he definitively said, women don't study Talmud. So what's happening, I really want you to kind of emphasize the revolutionary nature of what you've just spoken about.
The first Talmud class in Stern College was taught in the 1970s by Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik.
Uh-huh.
His daughter studied Talmud with him. His son-in-law comes to Israel. David Hartman comes to Israel. Another person that we barely mentioned, Rabbi Chaim Bravender, who actually had some background in Haredi Yeshiva, but was a student of Soloveitchik. He's the first person who starts a yeshiva for women to study Talmud on a high level in Israel, originally with Anglo-English speakers, but eventually for Israelis. Today, it's what's going on both in America and Israel, but Israel is really the centerpiece of it, of multiple advanced institutions for women. Women are studying on levels never before. Not all rabbis. There's certainly many rabbis who still don't understand why women should study Talmud, but the cat's out of the bag. And this is arguably the greatest religious revolution of our times because it has opened up the main edifice of rabbinic civilization to more than half the population. And its impact on the evolution of Judaism moving forward and the connection between Jewish groups whether it be through the Maharat group in New York that Avi Weiss started, or whether through the Lindenbaum Institute or Migdal Oz or another thing that there's something called Women Halachic Advisors regarding family purity and family halacha issues, Jewish law. This is grounds up. It came from the grassroots, but it's being acknowledged by people who might have not been proactive in it and people who are quite committed. And I think that is something as a historian that's important. People can have great ideas, but they capture societies when there's a groundswell of people who are intent on them and commit themselves. And that is part of the phenomenon that I studied.
If it's time to wrap, I want to conclude with a question about you. First of all, it's enormously well-researched, tons of footnotes in the bibliography, but I presume in the case of this particular book, it comes from your own neshama. So tell me about how you fit into the world that you've articulated in this book.
A lot of people in the pews, so to speak, have come over to me and say, Professor Ferzinger, your book is so readable. It reads like a novel. And I'm like, really? And they say, yeah, it's a great story. We love it. So that's making me feel good.
I'm an academic. I'm a scholar. I also do creative writing. Let me say that it's a very readable book, but it's still got a ton of footnotes.
They're in the back. You can cut them out when you get them. I'm just kidding. Good. They have to have footnotes because as I teach my students, footnotes are the difference between scholarship and punditry.
Right, so you
could check me, but you don't have to read them if you don't want. So who am I? I grew up in a place called Riverdale, New York, in the Bronx. I grew up in what you guess you call a modern Orthodox home. Went to schools like SAR Academy, Riverdale, Ramaz High School in Manhattan, and then spent some time in Israel, 2 years studying yeshivot, and I attended Yeshiva University. I do want to say that Riverdale, I just wrote a piece that's going to be in Masorti magazine. Riverdale was a very liminal kind of porous boundary place. JTS was nearby. I read the Torah in the conservative shul when I was in high school. I had lots of connections with the conservative movement. So even though I was clearly ensconced within the modern Orthodox world, my rabbi was Yitz Greenberg as a kid. The Greenbergs were good friends, Avi Weiss. So it wasn't sort of a doctrine of orthodoxy. It was an orthodoxy of Klal Yisrael, of togetherness. And we were all involved in the Soviet Jewry movement, which was a movement that was not focused on religious observance, but on people's souls and just safety. But, big move for me was that I met my wife volunteering in the north of Israel when we were 20 years old. And we got married at 22, moved to Israel, left our families and built our lives here together. And so I certainly drew on that background. But then I was a rabbi of a synagogue in a place called Kfar Saba for 10 years while I was doing my PhD. I built the pre-academic program for new immigrants at Bar Ilan just when those thousands upon million almost Russian-speaking Jews were coming in the 1990s. I've served in the Israeli army. I did basic training, reservist, etc. Our children are brought up that way, but we really, really have always within our families, within our lifestyle, within the activities we're involved in, focused on the fact that we've chosen this path and we believe in it very strongly, but we respect very much our partnership and our brethren. So this book in that way reflects, people who modeled that. On the other hand, for a long time, we felt like we were weirdos. And I could tell you numerous stories, anecdotes about when I was a rabbi and people didn't get me. Why is the rabbi encouraging women to dance with the Torah? Why does the rabbi think that, it's important to study various works that other rabbis would never study? Why is the rabbi getting a PhD while he's doing that? And all sorts of things. I'm not saying it was the only one, but at the time it was sort of niche-y. It was a niche. And so when I noticed there were more people to talk to, I said, well, how'd this happen? Where'd they go? It wasn't me. Maybe I was a little bit of a part of it. But what I do for a living is I'm a professor in a very well-established academic research institution. I actually wrote my master's for Jacob Katz, one of the most famous Jewish historians of the 20th century. And I wrote my PhD with Gershon Bacon, a great historian of Eastern European Jewry. And I did that on 19th century Jewry. I learned German. I wrote about Hungarian Jewry. And over time, I started to write. I wrote a book called Beyond Sectarianism, which won the National Jewish Book Award. What I do want to say, though, is that I got my foot in many worlds, and that certainly comes across in my book. And like I said, those footnotes may be intimidating, but they're the ones that you got to read if you want to see if Ferzinger is just making this up or if this stuff is compelling. I think it's compelling. That's what my colleagues say. I also hope it's not just compelling. It's actually encouraging and maybe thought-provoking. That's the most important word, because if we think seriously about some of these issues, maybe some good could come of it too.
Rabbi Dr. Adam Ferzinger, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Phil. Shalom. Toda rabba.
All too. Yalla bye. Thanks for listening to the Voices of Israeli Rabbis podcast. I hope you enjoyed the program. Stay tuned for future episodes as, with the help of my guests, I continue to unpack the diverse lives of rabbis who have made Israel their home. Please give the podcast a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow the audience of people interested in the lives, hopes, and dreams of the life of the Jewish state. Special thanks to Steve Lubetkin of Lubetkin Communications for engineering this episode. You can reach me at Rabbi Phil Cohen at ravphilmcohen@gmail.com. That's ravphilm.cohen, ravphilm.cohen@gmail.com. See you next time.